Tonight we're turning down the volume to hear what's vanishing between heartbeats. An extinction so quiet it slips past headlines, yet close enough to touch. Before we begin, where in the world are you watching from? Tell me in the comments, then settle in, slow your breath, and let your shoulders soften. Because the most surprising thing about this silent extinction isn't its sadness, but the way the world keeps whispering its story through soil, starlight, and the hush of water. If we learn how to listen under the path, your feet know by muscle memory. A different city works without windows or clocks. The roof is a crust of pebbles and dust. The streets are capillaries of air between crumbs of earth. The citizens are bodies the size of commas and dots, threads and specks, and soft, armored ovals. So many that language thins, trying to name them all. Fungal filaments run as white, translucent avenues. A lacework that bridges root to root and trades in slow sugars for minerals lifted out of stone. Bacteria salt the walls of soil crumbs like stars crowding a winter sky, each carrying a recipe for turning yesterday's leaf into tomorrow's breath. Springtails vault through cathedrals of empty space that a raindrop once left behind. Mites patrol the corners with patient mandibles. Nematodes thread needles no needle can see. The air down here is damp and mild. The light is a rumor. And yet it is the loudest silence in the world. A constant conversion of fallen things into food, of fragments into forms. Roots write letters, the length of a season. The hair-thin ends press forward like careful explorers, pausing to sip from films of water that wrap each grain the way fog wraps a hill. They release small sugars that smell like a promise, exudates with the softness of syrup, stipends paid in advance to microbes that will deliver phosphorus and zinc and stories about drought. Where root and fungus clasp hands, a seam of exchange glows with a chemistry older than any map. The plant grows a little braver, the fungus grows a little richer, and an invisible library adds a page on how to survive a hot week without complaint. The architecture that results, crumbs glued together by microbial resins, arches held by hyphal threads, lets rain enter without drowning, and lets air linger without leaving, so that every creature with gills small enough to live in a drop can breathe. A leaf that fell last month lies on a velvet of rot made by last year's hands. Beetles arrive first, cutting and ferrying. Then millipedes shred the script into confetti. Then fungi and bacteria take the tiny pieces and read them fully. The brown softens to dark tea. The veins slacken. The whole thing turns to a sweet, clean smell that lifts when you disturb it. An aroma that names 100 hidden cooks at once. If you were small enough to attend the feast, you would see cutlery of all sizes, chewing mouthparts, rasping tongues, acid baths, enzymes with keys that fit lignin and cellulose as neatly as a locksmith's work. What looks like disappearance from above is harvest from below. What looks like quiet is a queue of mouths working at the exact pace the world requires. Water carries news into these rooms. The first drop knocks, the second gathers, and soon a film threads from grain to grain, reuniting neighborhoods that heat had separated. Microbes swim for an hour where they had crept for a month. Flagella bloom from bacterial bodies like emergency oars. A nematode changes lanes and finds the scent it was following is closer than it believed. Pores fill, then drain, then stay damp, and the soil clings to the last of the gift, the way a good cloth holds a spill at the edge. When the rain quits, the news recedes, but does not vanish. Moisture remains in the smaller rooms, the ones only fungi can enter, and work continues behind shut doors. A drought arrives with soft feet at first, less patter on the roof, longer pauses between deliveries, and the city tightens its belt, switching to slow metabolism, banked embers, messages sent by touch instead of by wave. When water returns, 1,000 lids lift at once, and the sound, if you could hear it, would be the gentlest applause. Stones have addresses here, and each address is a habitat. Sand grains make bright, big rooms the size of tiny cathedrals where air moves and sound, if it existed, would echo. Silts are halls and corridors, spaces that fit the side of a mite and no more. Clays are libraries, with pages stacked so close together water can slip in, but turn only sideways. The mix of them is a city plan, part luck and part ancestry, held together by the sticky gifts of microbes and the winding rebar of hyphae. Earthworms pull the plan together, tunneling like miners with tender hands, lining passageways with glossed walls, dragging leaves into the dark until the leaf becomes the dark. Their casts are small sculptures, rounded, intricate, exactly the right firmness to resist collapse and the right softness to welcome rain. And seeds fall into them and find rooms ready-made. There are currencies here, and there are thieves, and the balance keeps its own order. Ammonia becomes nitrate, and then becomes leaf, or it becomes laughter, and disappears into the air, unless someone grabs it in time. Carbon is stacked in molecules that once were breath and now a brick. Later, they will become sugar again and go upstairs to be fruit. A mite eats a fungus that ate a leaf, that watched a sun, that lifted water through a root, built from a sugar made by a chloroplast that remembers a very old ocean. The line is unbroken, even where it bends. Sometimes trouble visits. A salt wind drops its crystals on bare soil, and the city winces. A weight rolls overhead, and the paws collapse into each other like books knocked off a shelf. A bright powder rains down, and mouths go quiet, and the silence spreads like a stain. The city endures longer than any single bad hour, but every bad hour has a weight, and weight accumulates. Under pavement, sound changes. A boot heel taps, and the echo is hard and near. Rain arrives and cannot enter. Heat gathers like a thought you can't let go of. The city below goes dim, then still. The couriers move with difficulty. The glue that bound the crumbs dries and cracks. Fine filaments snap at the throat of an empty paw. Some citizens die and do not return as quickly. Others curl and wait as if for a long winter. A line of ants finds a seam and patrols it the way a border guard does when a gate is shut. The work of interleaving air and water pauses, and above, the roots that had hoped to sip along the way meet a wall and turn aside. The path becomes convenient. The ground becomes lonely. In fields that are asked to produce without pause, the city shifts to meet the tempo of the demand. Plows invert neighborhoods like books flung open on the wrong page. A million creatures that prefer the dark squint and dry in the light, and the ones that prefer the light are churned into rooms with no doors. The first years bring a rush. So many mouths, so much sugar, so much nitrogen freed at once that stems leap and leaves gleam. And then a quiet follows that is hard to name until you place a hand on the soil, and it feels lighter than it used to. A little more like ash than like bread. But when harvests rest, when stubble is left to lie, when straw stoops in a low wind and catches snow, when a tractor's weight is kept from the ground when it is wet, when a hedge throws shade along a ditch and insects stitch evening there, the city below lifts its head. Fungi find each other again across the thin country. Bacteria set up house between crumbs that have learned how to cling. Worms visit from neighboring towns with cargoes of leaf. Forests keep older customs. In needleduff and leaf mold, generations stack until footsteps sound soft and words exchange through roots at a pace that would teach patience to a clock. A fallen trunk becomes a long apartment building, addresses written in rot, the damp end for salamanders, the sunlit side for beetle larvae in curls like pale commas, the underside for glossy millipedes with feet like rain. Mycelium threads the lot into a single nervous system. When a drought leans its dry brow against a slope, one grove shares water with another, and down in the soil the transaction is logged in a ledger that no one's eyes can see, only the relief of leaves at noon. where a fire passed lightly one autumn and the ash settled thin as flour. The city below ate grief and turned it into the black crumbs that hold water and memory for a dry spring. A kindness paid from accounts kept in darkness. Even the smallest corners have their grand stations. Under a stone, the size of a palm heel, the air is cool and damp as a held breath. Pillbugs practice their curls. Centipedes polish their pace. A spider engineers a net that reads vibrations finer than any fiddle. Out in a patch of moss, zoospores swim for minutes in the film between two leaflets. A migration that would be an epic if any epic allowed its hero to be smaller than dust. Along a single hair root the width of a thread, bacteria arrange themselves by need and gift, exchanging molecules like letters, and a tiny wasp deposits an egg in a fly that will never know the difference between winter and sleep. A teaspoon is a world, a handful is a cosmos, a garden bed is a country, a meadow is a continent whose people do not raise flags because their work is the flag. The ledger of who remains and who has left is written in the speed of puddles. In a healthy patch, a rain pools and then withdraws as if lifting a skirt. An hour later, the surface is only damp and the crumbs are fat with gratitude. In a quiet patch gone wrong, water stands confused in a shining sheet and then leaves quickly, taking silt with it, abandoning the city to thirst the next day. Each bare summer, each winter without snow, each salt shaken on a road, each heavy passage when the ground is tender, adds a page to the thinner book. Yet the opposite pages fill too. A log left to soften, a path rerouted around a new tree's shadow, a patch of leaves allowed to lie where they fell, a pot left upside down by accident, making a cave no blueprint could have improved. Sometimes you can hear the ground exhale. Lift a slab you forgot in the yard, and the smell rises like a hymn. Earth, mushroom, iron, green tea. A chemistry that names life without choosing favorites. Put your ear close in a quiet hour, and you will not hear voices, but you may sense a pressure, the hum of exchange in slow motion. If you return the slab and leave it ajar by a thumb's breadth, the city thanks you in work, not words. In the way a sapling's leaves stay glossy through a hot week, in the way the lawn needs less water than the app predicted, in the way the robin returns to the same patch after rain, because the city you cannot see has stocked the larder with soft, wriggling commas. Under the footpath, even the stones learn the pace of breath. Freeze and thaw articulate pause. Roots and hyphae stitch edges. Rain tickles and then persuades. Extinction here does not shout. It is the slipping away of a guild, a function, a tone in the chord. The detritivores who translated leaf into loaf. The nitrifiers who tuned ammonia into a song roots could sing. The dark archivists who held carbon the way a hand holds a secret. Their leaving is marked not by empty space, but by a change in how the ground behaves. Water that lingers too long or not long enough, stems that tire early, birds who find nothing in a place that used to be hopping. And still, with the smallest reprieve, the city sets about rebuilding itself, brick by living brick, laying Haifa across distances like a bridge built from thread, greeting a seed with a cushion of crumbs, catching the next rain not as a surprise, but as the next line in a story it has told for a very long time. When the sun folds itself away and windows dim, a different shift clocks in with no bell, carrying the day forward on small wings and soft feet. Moths arrive first, dusted like old books, their patterns the color of bark and rain. They test the air with feathery antennae, sniffing a map stitched from perfume and cool. Night-blooming flowers reply on schedule, opening petals that taste faintly of sugar and moonlight, pooling nectar like shallow bowls left at a doorstep. Some blossoms hide their colors and speak in scent alone: tobacco, jasmine, cactus, and the moths read them as easily as you might read your name. Long tongues uncoil like measuring tapes and glide past spurs and thorns to the secret cup. When the moth lifts, pollen anchors to fur and rides to the next lantern of fragrance. A quiet exchange repeated so often, the meadow remembers the pattern even when no one is watching. Bats draw their roots in invisible chalk. They drop from rafters and leaf caves and fold the night around their bodies like a cloak, then open it with each beat. Their mouths write quick equations in sound, notes so high they slip past the ear. Echoes return with answers. Gnat here, beetle there, open lane ahead, water below. And the bats bank without a thought. Some skim rivers so closely their wings lift ripples. Some hover at flowers like moths, with warm blood, sipping sugar and dusting their noses with gold. A bat's hunger is measured in mosquitoes avoided, in moths already accounted for, in beetles no longer fretting leaves. The ledger is clean, the math precise, the reward adorns sleep in a place that smells of wood and safety. Fireflies dress the understory in patient signals. A green pulse there, a softer one over the ditch, a low constellation suspended at knee height that rewrites the horizon to include the hedge. Each species keeps its own tempo and dialect, a careful punctuation of summer sentences. In meadows that remember a few wet corners and a few uncut weeks, the messages travel, here, 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 along roads where light bleeds into grass, from lamps that try too hard at helpful. The dialogue falters, too bright to read a whisper, too constant to invite reply. Yet one shielded yard, one alley where bulbs burn lower and warmer, can become a stage again, and the pulses resume like breathing. Nocturnal bees exist, despite daylight's confidence. Some are painted the color of dusk, with eyes enlarged to drink starlight. They work crepuscular shifts, visiting pale flowers that lose their fragrance by noon, and regain it at the hour when tea cools on a step. They move quietly, packing pollen on their legs like careful shoppers, navigating by memory and the faintest glister on a petal's edge. On certain nights when the air holds still and the moon is a coin behind thin cloud, you can feel their industry in the way a garden seems to lean forward, as if the plants themselves are listening for footfalls. In hedgerows, hedgehogs and opossums keep the aisles tidy. They browse for fallen fruit, beetles turned on their backs, snails that forgot to hide under the lip of a stone. Their work is municipal and affectionate, a city crew that knows which bins to check and which corners breed litter. Where fences breathe, boards spaced like ribs, gaps under gates, their roots remain intact. Where walls seal to ground with bright, flat certainty, the lanes end and the night workers double back, wearing their paths thinner, trying new gardens that never quite feel like home. Owls file the sky's paperwork with a glide and a turn. Silence is the point. Soft fringes on feathers blunt the rasp of air, and the mouse below only hears its own small arrangements until the world lifts around it. The owl's faces are saucers tuned to sound. A footstep 6 yards away in dry grass, a rustle under snow that should not move. These become coordinates, and the body follows. They patrol regular circuits, checking ditches and field margins, the dark seams where vole paths braid under thatch. A single fence post can become a courthouse, verdicts reached with patience. No spectacle, only the continuity of a role practiced long enough to become a place. Over water, the script grows glossier. Mayflies rise like ash from a careful fire, a hatch so dense the river seems to breathe dust. Trout draw rings under the scattered stars. Dragonflies, daytime's hawks, sleep clinging to reeds, while their nightkin, smaller, subtler, lift and work the air where gnats spin and undo themselves. Bats write cursive over the surface. A heron, weed-colored and stern, lifts one leg at a time along the margin and freezes exactly when the night says freeze. Ripples travel gossip from bank to bank. Something fed here, something entered there. A frog spoke and then thought better of it. A rat swam with a twig. On dry ground, foxes stitch neighborhoods together with a route only they and a few cats can see. They pass through gardens that hold their breath, step over sleeping hoses, edge under shrubs that hold nests like teacups. Their noses read newspapers printed in scent. Who crossed, how long ago, with what intention? They unearth grubs, collect windfall apples, pad down alleys, at a pace that looks leisurely only to someone who doesn't know the schedule of dawn. When streetlight pools dazzle the pupil to a coin, they blink and choose the verge where shadow stitches its own path, weaving a safe seam along the edge. Night-blooming cactus and baobab, kapok and sibo, trees and succulents in warmer places open grand dining rooms after dark. Bats with tongues like paintbrushes come to drink and leave wearing pollen as epaulettes. Moths the length of a finger dive to where nectar hides at the end of a narrow tube and emerge perfumed and responsible. Some flowers withhold reward from daylight entirely, trusting their architects of the small hours. Some paint landing strips in ultraviolet, invisible to us, but obvious to those with the right eyes. These arrangements are old and local, signed with coiled spurs and precise tongues, a handshake between species we rarely witness even when we're near. Light at night is a kind of weather, and many nights are clear in the wrong way. Sky glow lifts over towns like a permanent false dawn. Insects whirl around bulbs until their small engines run out. Migrating birds veer toward towers to circle and circle. The countryside remembers darker tricks. Hedges that break the wind so moths can read a scent. Ditches that carry cool air like a handrail. Ponds that hide their shine under a screen of rush. By default, not design. When a bulb is shaded, when a fixture points down instead of out, when a window learns a curtain late in the evening, the old roots reappear. You can feel it in the way moths begin to use the street again as a corridor instead of a wall, in the way bats choose the village center instead of skirting it, in the way silence thickens into the soundscape of soft work resumed. Even cities keep pockets where dark survives. Courtyards with high walls and climbing vines, rail lines softened by volunteer trees, rooftops that collect sedum and a pan of rain. These become temporary countryside. Night blooming cereus on a balcony finds its pollinators because somewhere 3 blocks away a vacant lot holds a night shift's worth of moths. A swift takes insects under a bridge lit by amber instead of ice. A bat roosts in a soffit beside a library and drops into the river of air that slides between buildings after midnight. The map of night workers looks nothing like the map of roads. It is made of currents and cover, of pauses where scent accumulates, of ledges that catch warmth after sundown. Migration prefers darkness. Warblers no heavier than a handful lift at dusk and climb into the compass of stars, carrying maps written in magnet and sky. They pass over sleeping towns, counting degrees of drift, and descend at dawn into hedgerows that smell of dew and insects. If the hedge is gone, if the field glows from its edge, they spend their mornings stitching calories together from whatever remains. On some nights, the radar sees them as weather, a bloom spreading from the south like green rain. When clouds light without lightning and the ground looks like day, some birds keep flying beyond their fuel, and the next dawn holds a few fewer songs. But on nights when the horizon stays properly dark and the air cools in even steps, the wind carries them like a quiet belt, and they land in places where crickets report abundance and moths rise in slow confetti. The soft hours teach plants too. Stomata in leaves open wider when the air cools and humidity rises. Water climbs trunks in a tall whisper. Nectar glands fill for the first shift. Flowers that closed at noon relax their grip. Pale petals turn their faces to darkness. Pollen dries to just the right dust to leap. The work is intricate and timed. A moth arrives when sugar is highest and scent strongest. A bat comes when the corolla has loosened enough not to bruise. Even grasses exchange signals under the dew. Chemistry that says, grow here and wait there. And roots taste the change in the night's temperature gradient as if reading a letter from deep soil. There is bookkeeping down these lanes of shadow. A lamp dimmed by a third returns a handful of moths to a hedge. A wet ditch left unpaved becomes a dragonfly nursery that also feeds swallows and bats. A window garden of night-scented stock turns one balcony into a pollinator station whose visitors carry dust to the next balcony and the next. A meadow cut in thirds, one in spring, one in summer, one in fall, keeps a pantry open without gaps for bees and beetles that don't keep the same calendar. None of this is loud. It is accounting done in pencil, added to slowly, balanced nightly by wings and whiskers. Sometimes the night is noisy in the right way. A choir of frogs along a canal times its calls with the breeze so predators don't fix the sound. A tawny owl answers from the allotments and is answered from the park. A fox barks once in an alley and gets 3 replies and a hush. Stand still and your ears widen. There's the dry paper sound of a moth's wing on a misjudged leaf. There the liquid click of a beetle on a tile. There the feathered sigh of something that knows how to pass between hedges without touching a leaf. These are proof-of-life notes in a ledger that is mostly quiet, certified every dusk and dawn. And always there are the walkers and the watchers who learn to step softly. A porch light becomes a lamp on a lower wick. A bat box appears on a wall. A hedge grows shaggy on purpose along the back fence, and the lawn remembers a few weeks of being a meadow. A child sits with a blanket and counts flashes by the pond and gives them numbers because names aren't needed when the language is glow. A street chooses amber over blue. A path gets a dark hour written into its contract. A window is opened to the smell of jasmine because someone noticed the bud at noon and wanted to be home by 10. The night workers do not ask for applause. They only ask for a little shade, a few seams, and the patience of those who sleep to let them stitch tomorrow into place, while the clock says it is today. Begin at the riffle, where water finds its voice. It hurries over stone, the size of fists, flashes white where it grips and lets go, and breathes the air into itself with 1,000 tiny hands. Beneath that froth, life's anchor to the undersides of pebbles, mayfly nymphs with leaf-thin gills fanning slow as sleeping lungs, stoneflies neat as calligraphy, caddisflies dwelling in jackets they've stitched from sand and twig. They face upstream and sway, turning current into conveyor belt, the river bringing dinner to the front door grain by grain. Between stones runs the hyporheic world, a braided twilight where river water and groundwater mingle. Here the temperature holds steadier than the sun can manage, and microbes keep a library, copying leaf into energy, nitrogen into song, memory into resilience. Downstream the riffle loosens into a run, then sighs into a pool that holds sky. In the pool's hush, salmonids suspend like punctuation marks, fins flexing just enough to hold their place. At the rim, where fast becomes slow, a scimitar of gravel gleams, the very size eggs prefer. In seasons with snowmelt and honest flood, the river combs these gravels clean, rolling silt downstream to settle where it belongs. When floods fail and the water hides in its banks too long, fine dust drifts into the spaces between stones and knits a tight, airless blanket. The little librarians below, the ones with gills like lace and mouths that scrape algae from glass, grow fewer, and the river's sentence shortens. Along the bank, willows bow and alders sow shade. Their roots stitch the soil and serve as soft architecture for shelter. Fish slide under roots when hawks etch the noon. Otters thread through the dark to teach their young the scent of stone. Each autumn, leaves step into the water and begin again from the beginning. Shredders arrive and make confetti. Grazers arrive and keep the film honest. Collectors hold sieves to the current and dine on what the rest discard. A single leaf becomes a winter's worth of meals for 100 mouths you've never heard. And the river carries the essence onward, as it always has, small to smaller to simplest, then back to body. Beneath the bright skin, the river runs backward in whispers. Springs feed from below, cold tongues that slip in under warm afternoons. In these seams, muscles listen with their bodies. They seat themselves like books on a shelf, hinging open and shut in slow motion, filtering the day into clarity. A colony the size of a blanket can strain the water above into a version of itself the fish remember. Where they go missing, the water keeps more secrets, and light cannot reach as far into the pool to tell a plant what time it is. Their larvae hitch rides on fish with old passports. A dam that is only 3 feet tall can be a border too high. Rivers keep 2 calendars, the one we see and the one under gravel. Snowmelt writes a bold hand in spring. Summer thins the line and invites algae to paint with a wide brush. Autumn deals leaves and cools the ink. Winter hardens the page. Below, eggs lie in reds, breathing through spaces no wider than a whisper. If a tractor enters when the ground is soft, if banks are shaved into shortness, if a storm arrives after a long drought and all the loosened soil lifts at once, those spaces fill and the future waits somewhere else. The sound from the bank remains cheerful, but under the cheer, the rooms are empty. Where rivers were straightened, their hip bones ache. A meander is a kind of patience, bending energy across a floodplain, laying silt here and lifting gravel there, inviting a willow to grow a toe in the inside bend, asking the current to rest at the outside and give a fish a place to think. Floated straight for convenience, the water learns to sprint and forgets how to stay. Without access to its low fields, it carries floods like a burden instead of a duty, and the first hard rain leaps banks that no longer expect company. When bends are returned by spade and backhoe, when floodplains are unbuttoned, the river remembers its soft S with astonishing speed, writing new shallows for fry and slow corners for craft made of reed and patience. Bridges and culverts are doorways that sometimes fit the wrong creature. A culvert perched 2 inches above the bed may as well be a cliff to a fish no longer than your finger. Replace the pipe with an arch that keeps a natural bottom, and the old paths reappear, mapped in the muscles of bodies that have not forgotten upstream. At the mouths of larger dams, ladders climb and elevators lift, and yet a body that evolved to read flood and temperature and smell hesitates at concrete. Where a dam finally comes down, the first flood combs a century's silt into the sea. Behind the plume, gravel speaks again, and a salmon in a river that hasn't had one in a lifetime finds the riffle as if it had been waiting. In dry lands, the river is a memory written under sand. Arroyos lie blank for months, then write themselves in an hour with a pulse that smells of creosote and lightning. Aquifers braid with these surface flashes. Tamarisk and willow argue in the margins. Beavers, where they return, draw water out of the air by slowing it, their low dams raising the level of the whole conversation for miles. A beaver pond is a larder for dragonflies, a nurse for sedges, a firebreak that keeps green through a season when everything else is tinder. Fish that wear desert colors hold under their cool shade. Birds that chase insects write lines low over water, where before there was map only. Cities stroke the river with many hands. Outfalls shrug a little warmth, a little detergent, a little salt from winter. Bridges shadow a stretch and send swallows looping. Parks pitch lawn to the edge, as if the river were a mirror that wants company. Where banks are armored, the current hums a held note. Where a patch of reeds persists, the water throws its shoulders down and relaxes. Road salt bows the grasses in late winter and teaches the water a taste it never asked for. Oil writes shy rainbows in the first minutes of a shower and then dissolves into chemistry too small to see. Yet even here, kingfishers persist, pinning blue to air like an argument for mercy. Even here, a child lowers a jar and lifts a water boatman who rows with oars so perfectly named you remember how language began. The river keeps bookkeeping in stones and skins. A cobble turned in June is slick with peripheton and handprints of snails. In October, it is mottled with leaf tannin. In January, it smells metal cold and clean. Fish carry their histories like flags. A lamprey sucker scar, a notch from a heron's bill, a new silver flash where scales grew back. Frogs mark their years by the width of their throats and the timing of their songs. When spring comes early and dry twice in a row, their chorus shifts key, and the ledger notes fewer commas of eggs attached to last year's grass. Crayfish wave chelae at the world and write their signatures in crescent tracks along the silt at pool's lip. Where their tracks vanish, an egret stands with an expression that is not quite disappointed, only expectant. Silences spread in the water, the way fog spreads in valleys, softly from low to low. You can miss them if you only look for spectacle. A riffle that used to sound like torn silk and now whispers like satin. A log that used to gather minnows at noon and now casts a shadow without company. A stretch where kingfishers used to argue and now only one voice pipes occasionally and then moves on. And then, just as quietly, music resumes where care has been practiced long enough to matter. Shade returned by a single row of trees takes 3 summers to lean over the run. The temperature tips 2 degrees on a week of heat, and fish remain rather than retreating to the spring seam. A mussel bed that was down to 10 books on the shelf recruits a dozen hand-sized readers in a year with honest water. Up in the headwaters, snow remembers to pace itself when the mountain wears trees all the way to the stream. Needles filter sun, roots hold the skin, and melt steps down in trickles rather than leaping in sheets. The creek runs cold in July and does not vanish in September. Bull trout or their kin claim deep blue shadows behind boulders the size of sleeping bears. Dippers stitch flight just above the skin, walking underwater against the current with wings they never show to the sky. Where a burn ran hard and hot, the river lies shallow and bright and quick to warm. Plantings of willow throw shade in 5 years and refuge in 7. And fish names return to the map the way old family names return to a street after a long absence. Some rivers are bookended by tides that breathe twice a day. The salinity line wanders like a cat, sometimes sleeping under the bridge, sometimes prowling miles upstream. In these brackish chapters, lives are written in gradients, smelts using both alphabets, reeds bending and unbending to the moon's fluency, crabs testing a burrow that will taste different at breakfast than it did at supper. When flow from the hills weakens, the cat wanders farther inland and naps on the roots of trees that did not grow to taste salt. Leaves sadden. Fish that prefer fresh tuck themselves against springs and wait for a storm's clean sentence. The river teaches by repetition, without boredom, fast over stones, slow in pools, braid where the valley widens, single thread where it tightens. Give back to the field with every honest flood. Take leaf and gratitude with every gentle recession. Where we step back, it steps in. Where we lower light, it lifts drift. Where we keep machines from the banks when the ground is soft, it keeps banks from the road when the water is hard. The fainting is not a fall, but a sway. And the antidote is not miracle, but breath. Shade, space, gravel that can move, culverts that are doors, dams reconsidered. A little patience written into the way we greet rain. Listen at dusk to the reach behind the old mill. A heron clicks its knees into place, a sound like folding a knife. A bat writes cursive. The water counts stones with its fingertips and is satisfied with the number. Beneath all this, a mussel sips, a mayfly fans, a caddis polishes its pebble house, and the hyporheic corridor braids cool into warm like a mother's hand entering a fevered room. The river is not a line on a map, not a border or a resource. It is a long animal with gills for lungs and stones for ribs, fainting when its room's empty and rising when its breath deepens, always teaching the shapes of care to those who lean close enough to learn. Begin where the sand turns to grass and the water slows enough for blades to lift. A meadow lies under the tide, each blade a ribbon that breathes by day and sighs by night, catching silt as if welcoming snow, knitting loose grains into soil that was water yesterday and is root today. Tiny snails graze the film of life on the leaves. Pipefish drift like green punctuation, pointed noses nudging the current. A seahorse, all elbows and patience, anchors its tail to a stem and becomes an idea rather than a fish. When the sun is high, bubbles rise in steady strings from the surface of the leaves, oxygen stitched into water as neatly as a hem. When clouds gather, the meadow darkens without fear, because its work is not a performance, but a habit. Rays lift the mat like a carpet to sip at clams. Turtles graze as slowly as hours. The meadow yields and then returns, resilient from the practice of bending. Follow the meadow outward, and the ground tilts into rooms made by limestone bones. A reef begins in fragments, coral heads the size of baskets, then tables broad enough for shade, then buttresses that reach upward as if remembering air. The first thing you notice, if you listen with your skin, is sound. A crackle, like distant rain on dry leaves, the voice of snapping shrimp, and the minute grindings of mouths on rock, soft clicks and knuckles from fish testing shells, a purr from water folding itself around a ledge. In a living reef, the sound is constant, as comforting as a market morning. Even blind, you could find it by ear. Where the quiet has grown, where color has thinned from riot to pastel to chalk, the crackle falls away, and the water feels larger than it should, like a hall unfurnished. Corals build with mouths and sunlight. Algae live within their tissues, and the day is a long exchange. Sugar for shelter, lime for architecture, room for the next tender mouth to settle. Polyps extend at dusk, 1,000 tiny hands catching what the day did not give. Parrotfish, with beaks that sound like patience when they rasp, graze the film of living skin off dead parts and keep the surface ready for births yet to come. Their sand drifts into beaches that later hold footsteps that later wash back. Wrasses cruise in teams, cleaning stations opening for business when a grouper hovers, jaw slack, letting small dentists floss gills and lips. A reef is a city of services like this, each transaction quiet, every participant a client and a clerk in turn. When the water warms beyond what the compact allows, the agreement loosens. The algae leave their coral rooms, color drains as if someone lifted a veil and replaced it with chalk. Polyps go hungry in bright light. Bleaching from a distance looks like purity. Up close, it is a subtraction. Fish that knew the alleyways hesitate in blankness. Small mouths test and find no film. The crackle thins. Sometimes the water cools and the compact is renewed and color returns as if exhaled. Sometimes a storm arrives with new tiles and the first settlers find a corner. Sometimes the chalk remains and erodes into history. In the meantime, other lives carry on. Urchins rasping star maps into limestone, damselfish tending gardens of turf with the seriousness of farmers, butterflies fanning over ledges like gossip. Between reef and meadow, sand plains appear to be empty until you kneel. Signatures write themselves in the top inch, the dotted line walk of a crab with one claw tucked like a violin bow, the cursive of a worm rising and vanishing. the round exclamation of a stingray resting under a dusting of grains, only the slight breathing of the surface giving it away. Here, a patch of Halimeda flakes into chalk chips after a week of work, adding another spoonful of material to tomorrow's K. There, a glossy garden eel field sways in unison, bodies half-masked from burrows, catching the drift without ever quite committing to leaving home. Every wind lays a new sentence. Every calm edits. Seagrass meadows are nurseries with more doors than walls. Larval fish practice being fish among the leaves, their bodies still glass, their movements undecided. Prawns mimic blades and become edges. Scallops set low and clap once when a shadow falls. The roots below are as busy as the leaves above, wrinkling sediment into micro-terraces that slow water and tuck away carbon in cupboards locked by mud. When storms come, the grass lies down, pins the bed with its own weight, and rises after, shaggy and unembarrassed, catching the first clear day like laundry on a line. Meadows dampen waves for shores that will never know the names of their protectors, and shores repay by letting a little leaf drift back each autumn. Noise arrives from afar, even on still days. Propellers write a low, insistent line through the music of the reef. Engines thicken water with bass that travels farther than light. Sonar pings and returns a world that did not ask to be described so loudly. Fish that speak in clicks and booms, groupers courting, drums living up to their name, find their voices wrapped in blanket. Whales passing on their own errands alter routes around corridors that hum. Dolphins pause mid-sentence, where a quiet afternoon survives behind a headland under a ban on hurry. The old band strikes up again. The crackle grows. A chorus of small talk resumes along the edges of the limestone rooms. Ears here are fins and lateral lines, and the whole body at once. To listen is to navigate. To hear is to belong. Light organizes the day on a reef with a thoroughness that would please a clockmaker. Dawn opens the plankton pantry, and cloudlets of mouths rise from ledges to feed in gold water. Mid-morning brings out grazers and cleaners. Noon sends some creatures under shelves, while others bask on pulsing mats. Afternoon draws shadows long and invites hunters to stretch. At dusk, a hinge turns. Day fish bed in branching corals. Night eyes ignite along the bottom. The city repeats itself in another register. In the meadows, the schedule is written in the chemistry of the leaves. Sugar up, oxygen out, tide crossing like a bell twice daily. Night brings the slow ballet of cuttlefish, lighting their thoughts along their skin. Squid signaling with commas of light. Shrimp thumping like distant hearths. There are caretakers with teeth, and there are caretakers without. Parrotfish turn weeds into sand. and treat sponges with a firm hand where they push too much. Urchins mow, their 5-part mouths playing quiet music on rock. Sea cucumbers hoover the space between grains and paste it together again, as if repairing a carpet thread by thread. But caretakers can flip into spoilers when balance leans. A reef without urchins grows shaggy with algae. A meadow without turtles tallies more leaves than light can sustain. Predators removed by chance or choice leave room for one voice to shout, and shouting is not how these places prefer to converse. When sharks pass less often, mid-level hunters widen their rounds. When those rounds grow too large, the little ones stop using the open and retreat to cracks. When they vanish, the cracks crumble from disuse. The quiet extinction here is less bodies gone than rolls gone, chairs at a table left unfilled, tasks undone invisibly until something obvious happens, and we call it sudden. Restoration, when it comes, speaks softly and repeats itself. Gardeners grow coral fragments on ropes and trees, letting the water carry food to them until they are strong enough to be glued to rock. The glue is simple, the placement obsessive. Flow here, light there, neighbors who won't crowd. Seagrass is planted by hand in squares that look like quilts. Shoots grip, spread, lace the gaps, capture the first silt, invite the second. Mooring buoys spare the anchors the work of tearing the same hole again. No-take zones grow old enough to become generous, spilling fish over their invisible fences into places that had forgotten what plenty looks like. The first returns are always small. A damselfish defending a plot on a coral transplanted last year. A turtle leaving crop marks across a new meadow. The quiet getting louder by a small degree each month until crackle and chatter and click add up to a background that feels like breathing. Heat presses the story forward, even when hands do not. A summer stretches. Water holds an extra degree the way a room holds a memory. Seagrass leaves bleach at the tips and recover lower down. Corals bleach at the tops and keep their color in the shade of their own architecture. The survivors are often the nubbier, the browner, the ones that never looked like postcards, and they become the new frames on which beauty learns to speak a slightly different dialect. In shadowed cuts and deeper terraces, the old blues and pinks keep a quieter festival. In shallows, crusts and encrusters practice a patience that outlasts a season. Then, too, fish learn the map again. Cleaners move their stations. Hawksbill turtles switch reefs to follow the sponges that stayed sweet. Adaptation writes itself in detours rather than in manifestos. Even in quieting, abundance hides in plain work. A single coral head the size of a barrel hosts more passports than a city hall. Crabs that match its color exactly, shrimp that act as doorbells, worms that never leave their calcareous tubes, blennies that pop in and out of holes like punctuation marks, snails that mow invisible lawns one molecule at a time. A seagrass blade holds a microcosm, diatoms glued in golden chains, bryozoans building lace, a tiny jelly washing up the blade in a wave the size of a fingernail's white moon. To count losses without counting these workings is to hear only the melody and miss the harmony, which is where the music lives. Shorelines listen even when they look away. Dunes stand because meadows stand. Mangroves catch nursery lives in their roots and release them to the reef when they have learned not to flash unless they must. Surf breaks over a bar built grain by grain from a community that eats limestone for a living and returns it as sand. Houses far inland sleep better on nights when storm swells find a meadow first. The wind that fans a field with a silver skin has been softened by a reef that raised the bottom closer to the surface simply by persisting. A quieting reef unthreads this fabric in ways that do not announce themselves loudest at the edge. A loud reef resown announces itself as calm where you live. There are nights when phosphorescence returns to a place that had forgotten it. Each step in the shallows writes a neon script. Each fin beat of a mullet lays down a comet. Each raindrop coins the surface with cold fire. This brightness is a byproduct of a crowd, plankton dense enough to practice light, and crowds only gather in water, held at the right temperature and stirred the right amount, over ground that has stories to tell. You can stand shin deep, sweep your hand, and watch 10,000 tiny votes for yes bloom and vanish. The meadow, dark under the surface, is breathing. The reef, out where the breakers mutter, is holding its rooms open. The sound under the crackle says not yet finished. Everything here uses edges, the fringe of a grass bed where sand grains fall out of the water and form a clear ribbon. The lip of a terrace where a cleaning station convenes. The mouth of a grotto where light and dark trade. Life stacks along these lines like books on a favored shelf. When the shelf is lost, the books turn to piles, bringing back a single edge, a line of grass along a channel, a ridge of rubble glued into a low wall, a boulder placed where current will comb it clean, can start a library again. Readers arrive unbidden, writers too, and the margins turn from white to annotated. For now, the sea holds both stories, the market's mourning and the closed stall, the meadow's sigh and the bare sands hush. Much of the work of keeping one from becoming the other is the kind of care that can be done without fanfare. Letting grass blades grow long enough to catch the next grain, lifting a single anchor to a floating ring, cruising a little farther from the ledge, choosing quiet in the evening where sound travels best underwater, leaving a corridor between river and sea so fresh can pulse without falter. Listen long enough, and you can tell which places have begun to remember. The crackle thickens, the chatter returns, the light on coral changes from blank to breathed, and in the soft lift and fall of the slowest swell, the reef and the meadow rehearse their lines again until they can speak them in their sleep. It begins with a list the world keeps in pencil, a pear with a perfect shine but no perfume, a pond that loses its choir at the warmest point of May, a hedgerow that used to hum like a wire and now murmurs as if someone closed a door half quietly. Wheat turns its heads early, not out of plenty, but because the clock inside the stem runs fast under a longer noon. A calendar on the fridge gathers marks. First swifts 2 days late, first dew a week early, first frost a rumor that doesn't come. The ledger writes itself in absence and in almost, in the way a walk route has fewer pauses because there are fewer reasons to stop and listen. Yet the same ledger stacks entries on the other page in the small, bright currency of what persists without announcement. A strip of uncut grass along a fence blooms into a thin country, and suddenly there are blue threads and yellow discs, bee pelvises dusted, crickets rehearsing, counting. A ditch that holds water 2 weeks longer hosts a parade. Damsel nymphs walking out on reeds, paper skins left like exclamation marks, frogs with throats the size of chestnuts, pulsings in an evening that smells of mint and mud. A heron stepping like punctuation through the shallow grammar of the banks. In the shadow of a single old oak, noon cools into a different hour, and a tired dog lies down and sleeps as if someone turned a page. The wind takes the temperature of that shade and learns a kindness it had not practiced in a while. On rooftops, shallow trays of soil thicken into fields with short horizons. Saddam holds rain the way a palm holds water for a bird. Poppies arrive by rumor and then by habit. A black redstart lands and looks surprised, which is always how colonization begins. Bees climb higher than their grandparents knew to climb, banking along brick canyons as if the planet had grown new cliffs. A window box of night-scented stock keeps office lights off at 10 and draws a moth the size of a small hand, which performs its work by lantern and leaves without complaint. There are trees that keep time for towns the way a church bell once did. Elders pour cool into the street at 4 in the afternoon. Lindens lend a smell that turns heads in June and makes the postman walk slower. Plane trees hold dust on their leaves like a museum accepting donations. Their roots knead earth into resilience. Their crowns quiet the loud corners. A jay drops an acorn beside the wrong curb, and a sapling misreads the map and begins. Along railway edges, Budleer tosses purple flags and draws butterflies to a platform where the announcements are wind and wing click. Along canal towpaths, nettles defend a palace for ladybirds and small blues with their mild sting. And there are always a few children willing to learn that price for the secret of seeing. In the ledger are the things the body notices before the mind does. A garden visited by swifts becomes a room with an open ceiling. Their sickle calls lift the ribs. A morning with thrush anvil tapping on a stone feels sounder than one without, though the milk tastes the same. The soft click of a bat passing the eave writes reassurance on skin without asking permission. When any of these disappears, the day keeps its appointments. But something in the arithmetic fails to balance, and you stand longer at the sink, as if listening for a name you have forgotten to say. Fields that have been asked to sprint learn, with rest, to walk again. A margin of flowers punctuates the paragraph of barley. Skylarks retake the air with a lift that seems casual and is not. The wind harvests pollen in 1,000 pale puffs that rise and fold, and beetles write tinier commas along the domes of daisies and move on with the kind of grace that doesn't need an audience. A tractor's tires step around a wet patch instead of through it, and the wet patch holds a secret hatch of flies that turns into swallows, then later into bats, and the evening ledger adds 3 quiet checks in a long column of almosts. The sea keeps a column for gifts that return. A horse muscle bed that had thinned to a rumour thickens into a room, and the water clears around it like a thought remembered. Eelgrass blades lift torn edges and grow past them, sowing themselves with light, so that their shadows move like curtains again. A shoal of young fish practices tensile strength along the edge, choosing to be a body more than a crowd. On a night when rain is needle fine and the wind forgets to push, phosphorescence wakes in a shallow bay that had slept a long sleep, and every footstep draws a line on the ledger bright enough to read without glasses. The entry is written in a language plankton knows, but it is legible to anything with eyes. Up in the hills, a road verge left wide and ragged catches seeds on its own sleeve. Harebells flex in a breeze that smells of hot stone. Knapweed holds bees at head height long enough for a driver to notice a colour and look again. The ditch bottom keeps a ribbon of water under a drought. No one in the village can remember, and made into this is the quiet miracle of a hedgehog, crossing at dawn and arriving, alive, in the next garden. The tally is measured in breaths held and breaths released. There are custodians who move by page, and there are custodians who move by paragraph. A neighbor decides to take the porch light to amber, and to sometimes. An apartment block chooses to cut the courtyard in thirds across the summer. A school keeps a quarter of the playing field as a meadow, and counts insects as homework, without grading anyone on neatness. A council lets grass grow long under trees, and adds a sign that says, "Meadow at work," so that tidy souls can recognize labor when they see it. In the ledger, these are small coins that add up to the kind of wealth that cannot be taxed, carried in the pockets of sparrows and in the minds of children whose first memory of June is not heat, but bees. Memory itself becomes habitat. An elder tells a child the name of the wind that comes down the valley at 4, and the child goes to the gate to meet it. A song about lampreys in the river is sung at a festival that no longer marks a catch, but still marks a season, and the river hears itself spoken and tries on the shape again. A recipe asks for nettle tops in spring, and the hands picking them see ladybird larvae clamped to stems like commas, and decide to leave enough for the punctuation to finish its sentence. Stories hold behavior. Behavior holds places open. Places open hold returns. In cities, soundscapes hint at health more reliably than metrics on signs. Some mornings carry a burble that means starlings have convened on a wire to compare notes. Others carry a 5-note pattern that means a blackbird is editing dawn. Some evenings include the dry rustle of wings at a corner where moths have begun to use the shade as a road. Late nights keep sometimes a fox conversation brief and practical. Marked against these, a street that sounds like a hallway loses a little weight when a single wren begins to freelance from a hedge someone forgot to trim, and the hallway becomes a room with a small, stubborn speaker. The ledger is geological in some places, and minute by minute in others. A peat bog that did not burn carries its cool into the next heat wave. It holds water the way a myth holds meaning, releasing it as if it were an instruction rather than a resource. A rock pool by the breakwater hosts a garden of snails that has survived 2 winters, and a party. A child lists the names learned by looking: topshell, limpet, periwinkle, blenny, anemone, and writes them on the underside of a flat stone with chalk that the tide will edit. The persistence of names becomes the persistence of creatures. Language secures space. What returns is often small before it is many. A single swift that inspects a nest box and finds it to its liking writes future above a window. One shrimp in a brook means the water has remembered cold and oxygen. A bumblebee queen choosing to dig under a step means the step will be noticed for months by people who did not know they were capable of noticing. A woodlouse that curls in a child's palm in perfect grey armor unlocks the kind of affection that is not anthropomorphic, only attentive. The next time the child rakes leaves, a corner remains untouched on purpose. There are marks of care that look like nothing has happened. A fallen branch not removed becomes a bird stage and an insect hotel. A leaf pile under a hedge stays on purpose and turns into 100 lodgings with doors sized for soft-bellied tenants. A puddle kept in a compacted path becomes a suite of baths for sparrows and a pantry for wasps who need a sip. The ledger captures these as no-entry entries, a column of restraint paid out as abundance, at a speed too slow for headlines and too fast for geology. Some losses write themselves with a felt-tip pen that refuses to fade, and the ledger does not pretend otherwise. A spring that never sings again, a meadow mown through in a good year because a calendar said it was time, a nesting wall rendered smooth in a renovation, a night made noon by a brand. Yet even there, the other page keeps a moral that is plain without being loud. One nest brick left, one terrace pot filled with mint that a moth can smell from the next roof. One corridor of unlit verge stitched across a village. One storm water basin planted all the way around and inside so dragonflies can multiply their commas. The mind keeps a list, but the body keeps a map. A street you used to take in late August because evening primrose opened as you passed, becomes another street if the primrose doesn't open, and you miss your turn as if a sign were gone. When someone plants an evening tree in a courtyard, something that throws a scent like a story just at dusk, the map draws a new node and roots feet that way. The neighbors come to know each other by the act of pausing. Under these changes moves the slow machinery of the world, the exchange of sugars under the pavement, the cold tongue of groundwater entering a river reach, the thread of fungus carrying news. The ledger notes paused here and breathed longer, and these annotations are currency. In the cool between sunset and night, the tally often looks better, simply because light allows certain workers back to their posts. A moth crosses the beam of a headlamp and becomes not an error in the glass, but a proof of life. A toad on a step looks like a knob until it moves, and the hand reaching for the knob learns to reach around instead. The ledger lives in habits more than in events, in a recalibration of gait and glance, of what is left untrimmed, and what is trimmed only after seed has had a chance to be deed. The old trees that anchor the book keep tutoring the margins. They drop branches that look like chores and are actually proposals. When accepted, those branches become nurseries and boardwalks for feet you don't see. Their caverns take rain and hold it at the lip, ladles for beetles and for birds that have not learned fear from you yet. Their bark writes textbooks for lichen, and lichen writes textbooks for air. A child prints a rubbing on paper with a crayon and takes home an essay written by time, and on the way sees a dragonfly rest on a reed with the stillness of an arrow that has found itself and doesn't need to fly any farther. There is a way to read the ledger out loud without raising your voice. It sounds like naming. Here, a bank of thrift and a bank of thrift's cousins Here the shadow that makes noon possible for trout. Here the corner where wind lays the scent that draws night pollinators over 3 fences. Here the stone that warms butterflies enough to open before the cat comes. Here the puddle with its perfect circle of prints like a family signing in. It sounds like timing. Leave that patch until the blue is done. Cut that one now, because the yellow likes a haircut. Water at dawn, so the leaves drink before the day tries to take it back. It sounds like refraining. Not this week. Not that lamp. Not the urge to tidy when the urge to host would do more good. All of which is to say, the silent extinction is only silent in a certain register. In others, it is full of remarks, the new call at the park, because the hedgerow learned to be a hedge again, the sudden appearance of a plant that smells like a story a grandparent told, and turns out to be that story with roots, the way the river surface finds its old diction once shade returns to 3 consecutive bends. The ledger's margins fill with these, written in handwriting that steadies as practice accumulates. No trumpets, just the quiet accounting of a neighborhood learning not only how to keep what remains, but how to invite the next return with a bowl of water. A light left off, a leaf left where it fell, a fence lifted by a hand so something soft-bellied can pass, and a promise to look and to keep looking until the map thickens the way a well-used book thickens with notes. Thank you for listening with me tonight. If this gentle journey helped you unwind, tap like and subscribe so the next story finds you. Share the moment that stayed with you and what quiet corner of the world you'd like to visit next. Until then, breathe slow, rest well, and good night.